Mehmed VI, the last sultan of the Ottoman Empire, is often remembered for his exile and the collapse of a dynasty that had ruled for over 6 centuries. But what became of his children, born into imperial privilege and then uprooted when the empire fell? In this video, we trace the lives of his daughters and his only son. From palaces in Istanbul to exile in Europe, from arranged marriages to untimely deaths, we follow the full arc of their stories. By the end, you'll understand not just the fate of one imperial family, but how the upheaval of a collapsing empire reshaped individual destinies. Let's go straight into their story. Today, we'll examine the lives of Mehmed VI's 4 children, moving chronologically through each of their stories. We'll cover their births in the imperial palaces of Istanbul, their upbringing during the twilight of Ottoman power, and what became of them as the empire crumbled around them. Each chapter will take us from birth through youth, adult life, marriage and family, their relationship with their father, and ultimately their legacy. This is the human story behind the end of an empire. In 1888, within the walls of an Ottoman palace in Istanbul, Mehmed VI welcomed his first child with Naziketa Kadun. The infant daughter was named Munire, though she would later appear in some genealogical records under the name Fenire, a confusion that would outlast her brief life by more than a century. At the time of Munire's birth, her father was not yet sultan. Mehmed VI was still a prince, living under the shadow of his uncle Abdul Hamid II's reign. The Ottoman Empire, though weakened, still controlled vast territories across 3 continents. Palace life continued with its ancient rhythms of ceremony and tradition, even as the first stirrings of nationalism and reform movements began to challenge the imperial order from within and without. Munire was born into a world of extraordinary privilege and equally extraordinary constraint. The imperial household of the late 19th century maintained elaborate protocols that had governed Ottoman royal life for centuries. Female members of the dynasty lived in carefully regulated quarters, their lives shaped by traditions that emphasized both their exalted status and their separation from the public world. The infant princess would have been attended by a retinue of servants and wet nurses, her every need anticipated by a household staff trained in the intricate etiquette of imperial service. The palace nurseries were appointed with the finest furnishings, and no expense would have been spared for the comfort and care of an imperial child, even in an empire beginning to feel the financial strains of military defeats and territorial losses. Yet for all the ceremony and care that surrounded her birth, Munire's life was tragically brief. Within weeks of her arrival, the infant princess died, leaving behind grieving parents and a father whose hopes for a thriving family had been suddenly curtailed. Infant mortality was high even among the wealthy and powerful in the 1880s, but this reality offered little comfort to Mehmed VI and Naziketa Kadun as they mourned their firstborn. The exact circumstances of Munire's death are not recorded in detail in the surviving palace records, reflecting both the private nature of the family's grief and the Ottoman court's tendency to maintain discretion about such personal tragedies. What we do know is that her death occurred before she could be formally presented at court or participate in any of the ceremonial occasions that would have marked her recognition as an imperial princess. For Mehmed VI, the loss of his first child represented more than personal grief, though that grief was undoubtedly profound. In the context of Ottoman dynastic politics, male heirs were essential for the continuation of the imperial line. But daughters, too, played crucial roles in cementing political alliances through marriage. The death of Munire thus represented both a personal loss and a diminishment of the family's potential political capital. The experience of losing a child so early in his parental life may have shaped Mehmed VI's relationship with his subsequent children. Contemporary accounts suggest that he was a devoted father who took considerable interest in his children's education and welfare, perhaps partly motivated by the painful awareness of how quickly a young life could be lost. Though Munire lived only briefly, her existence carries historical significance beyond the personal tragedy of her death. She represents the vulnerability that even the most privileged families faced in an era before modern medical advances. Her brief life also reminds us that the grand narratives of imperial politics played out against a backdrop of deeply human experiences, births and deaths, hopes and disappointments that touched even those at the pinnacle of power. The confusion over her name in historical records, sometimes listed as Munire, sometimes as Fenira, reflects the broader challenges historians face in reconstructing the personal lives of Ottoman royal family members. Palace records were often incomplete or deliberately vague about private family matters, and the political upheavals that followed the empire's collapse scattered and destroyed many documents that might have preserved more detailed accounts of these individual lives. In the context of her father's later reign and eventual exile, Munire's brief existence takes on additional poignancy. She died when the Ottoman Empire still seemed eternal and unshakable to most of its subjects. Her surviving siblings would grow up to witness and experience the complete transformation of their world, the end of the empire, the establishment of the Turkish Republic, and their own forced exile from the only homeland they had ever known. On September 11, 1892, 4 years after the tragic loss of Munire, Mehmed VI and Naziketa Kadın welcomed another daughter at Ortaköy Palace in Istanbul. Named Fatma Ulviye, she would become the eldest surviving child of the future sultan and witness nearly 8 decades of dramatic historical transformation. Ulviye's early years unfolded within the protected environment of the imperial palace, where every aspect of daily life reflected the grandeur and formality of Ottoman court culture. Ortaköy Palace, situated on the European shore of the Bosphorus, provided a picturesque setting for her childhood. The palace's gardens offered views of the straits that connected Europe and Asia, a fitting metaphor for an empire that straddled 2 continents and multiple cultures. As an imperial princess, Ulviye received an education befitting her station. The palace maintained a tradition of sophisticated learning for royal children, including instruction in multiple languages, literature, and the arts. Music held a particularly important place in her education. She became an accomplished pianist, a skill that would remain with her throughout her long life and provide both comfort and cultural connection during the difficult years of exile that lay ahead. The late Ottoman court had begun to modernize many of its practices by the 1890s, and Ulviye's education reflected this blend of traditional Ottoman culture and contemporary European influences. She learned French, which was the diplomatic language of the era, alongside Turkish and Arabic. Her tutors included both traditional palace scholars and European instructors who brought new pedagogical methods to the imperial household. The role of Ottoman princesses in this period was complex and evolving. While they enjoyed enormous privilege and luxury, their lives were also highly circumscribed by protocol and tradition. They were expected to embody the dignity of the dynasty while preparing for marriages that would serve the political interests of the imperial family. Ulviye grew up understanding that her personal choices would always be secondary to dynastic considerations. On August 10, 1916, at age 24, Ulviye married Damat Ismail Hakkı Pasha in a ceremony that reflected both the continuing grandeur of the Ottoman court and the growing uncertainties of wartime. The First World War was raging, and the Ottoman Empire found itself aligned with the Central Powers in what would prove to be its final major conflict. Ismail Hakkı Pasha was a military officer and member of the Ottoman elite, making him a suitable match for an imperial princess according to the standards of the time. The marriage produced one daughter, Suade Humera, born in 1917. This granddaughter would represent the continuation of the imperial bloodline through the female line, carrying forward the genetic and cultural heritage of the Ottoman dynasty into the modern era. However, the marriage to Ismail Hakkı Pasha was not destined to last. The couple divorced in 1922 during the tumultuous period that saw the end of the Ottoman Empire and the establishment of the Turkish Republic under Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. The timing of their divorce coincided with the broader dissolution of the old order, suggesting that the personal upheavals in Ulviye's life mirrored the political transformations sweeping across her homeland. On November 1, 1923, just 1 year after her divorce, Ulviye married Ali Heydarbeg Germianoğlu. This second marriage occurred as the new Turkish Republic was consolidating its power and moving toward the complete abolition of the monarchy. Within months of her remarriage, the law on the unification of education was passed, followed in 1924 by the formal abolition of the caliphate and the exile of all members of the Ottoman dynasty. The year 1924 marked the end of Ulviye's life as an Ottoman princess residing in her homeland. Along with other members of the imperial family, she was forced to leave Turkey, beginning a period of exile that would last nearly 3 decades. The family's departure from Istanbul was both physically and emotionally wrenching. They were leaving behind not just their palaces and possessions, but their cultural moorings and sense of identity. Ulviye's exile took her through several European cities and resorts favored by displaced aristocrats and wealthy refugees. She lived at various times in Sanremo, Monte Carlo, and Alexandria, moving within a cosmopolitan community of exiled royalty and nobility from across Europe and the former Ottoman territories. These communities provided some measure of familiar social structure and cultural continuity, but could never fully replace the homeland she had lost. During these years of exile, Ulviye maintained her dignity and continued the cultural practices that connected her to her Ottoman heritage. Her musical skills, particularly her piano playing, provided both personal solace and social entree in the international circles where she now moved. Music became a bridge between her lost past and her uncertain present, offering a form of cultural expression that transcended national boundaries. The financial aspects of exile were challenging for many former Ottoman royals. While some had managed to transfer wealth abroad before the dynasty's fall, the new Turkish government had confiscated most imperial properties and assets. Ulviye and her family had to navigate reduced circumstances compared to their former imperial lifestyle, though they remained more comfortable than most refugees of their era. Throughout these difficult years, Ulviye maintained a close relationship with her father, Mehmed VI. When he had become Sultan in 1918, she had held a special place as his eldest surviving child. He had demonstrated his affection by gifting her the twin palaces in Nişantaşı, a gesture that reflected both paternal love and the traditional Ottoman practice of providing for imperial daughters through real estate holdings. Mehmed VI's own exile began in 1922 when he fled Istanbul aboard a British warship as nationalist forces closed in on the capital. The former sultan spent his final years in Sanremo, Italy, where he died in 1926. Ulviye's proximity to her father during his exile years provided them both with emotional support during this period of displacement and uncertainty. She witnessed firsthand his struggle to maintain dignity while accepting the definitive end of his imperial role. The relationship between father and daughter during exile was marked by mutual respect and shared grief for their lost homeland. Mehmed VI had ruled during one of the most challenging periods in Ottoman history, facing military defeat, foreign occupation, and internal rebellion. Ulviye understood the impossible circumstances her father had navigated, and he, in turn, admired her resilience in adapting to exile. In 1952, nearly 3 decades after leaving Turkey, Ulviye was finally permitted to return to her homeland. The Turkish government under İsmet İnönü had begun to relax some of the restrictions on former Ottoman royals, particularly the female members of the dynasty who were seen as posing less political threat than their male relatives. Ulviye chose to settle in Izmir, the ancient city of Smyrna on Turkey's Aegean coast. This choice reflected both practical considerations and perhaps a desire to avoid the painful associations that Istanbul might have evoked. Izmir offered a more manageable scale of life compared to the former imperial capital, while still providing the cultural amenities that suited someone of her background and education. Her return to Turkey after so many years of exile must have been emotionally complex. The country she encountered was dramatically transformed from the Ottoman homeland she had left behind. The Turkish Republic had modernized rapidly under Ataturk and his successors, adopting Western dress, the Latin alphabet, and secular institutions. The Turkey of the 1950s bore little resemblance to the empire of her youth. Ulviye spent her final 15 years in Izmir, living quietly but maintaining the dignity that had characterized her throughout the upheavals of the 20th century. She died on January 25, 1967, at the age of 74, having witnessed the rise and fall of the Ottoman Empire, 2 world wars, and the establishment of modern Turkey. Her death marked the end of a remarkable personal journey from imperial princess to exile to private citizen of the Turkish Republic. She had navigated these transitions with grace, maintaining her cultural identity while adapting to radically changed circumstances. Her long life spanned nearly 8 decades of revolutionary change in the Middle East and Europe. Through her daughter, Suade Humera, Ulviye ensured the continuation of the Ottoman imperial bloodline. While this lineage no longer carried political significance, it represented an important cultural and historical connection to the empire that had once ruled much of the Islamic world. Her descendants have maintained awareness of their heritage while integrating into modern Turkish society. Ulviye's legacy extends beyond her bloodline to her role as a symbol of resilience and adaptation. She exemplified how members of displaced aristocracies could maintain their dignity while adjusting to reduced circumstances and changed political realities. Her story illustrates both the human cost of imperial collapse and the possibility of rebuilding meaningful life after profound loss. On March 19, 1894, Mehmed VI and Naziketa Kadun welcomed their second surviving daughter at either Ortaköy or Feria Palace in Istanbul. Named Rukiye Sabiha, she was born into an empire that was increasingly beset by internal and external pressures, though the Ottoman court still maintained its traditional splendor and elaborate ceremonial life. Sabiha's early years paralleled those of her older sister Ulviye, but she came of age during an even more turbulent period in Ottoman history. Born just 2 years after Ulviye, she would witness the Young Turk Revolution of 1908, the Balkan Wars, the First World War, and finally, the collapse of the empire itself. Her childhood and adolescence unfolded against this backdrop of increasing political instability and military defeat. Like her sister, Sabiha received a comprehensive education befitting an imperial princess. The palace educational system emphasized languages, literature, music, and the social graces necessary for her future role in Ottoman high society. Recent historical sources suggest that she was particularly accomplished in the cultural arts that were valued among the Ottoman elite. The late imperial court in which Sabiha grew up was characterized by a tension between maintaining traditional Ottoman customs and adopting European innovations. This cultural duality would prove valuable during her later years of exile, as she possessed both the cultural foundation of her Ottoman heritage and the adaptability necessary to navigate European society. The Ottoman court of Sabiha's youth was also marked by increasing awareness of the empire's precarious political situation. The loss of territory in the Balkans, the growing strength of nationalist movements, and the intervention of European powers in Ottoman affairs created an atmosphere of uncertainty that even the youngest members of the imperial family could sense. On April 29, 1920, at the age of 26, Sabiha married Shehzade Ömer Faruk, son of Caliph Abdülmecid II. This marriage was particularly significant because it united two branches of the Ottoman dynasty, Sabiha, daughter of the reigning sultan, with Ömer Faruk, son of the man who held the spiritual leadership of the Muslim world as caliph. The timing of this marriage was crucial, occurring during the final chaotic years of the Ottoman Empire. By 1920, nationalist forces under Mustafa Kemal were challenging the Sultan's authority, foreign armies occupied Istanbul, and the empire's territorial integrity had largely collapsed. In this context, the marriage represented an attempt to consolidate dynastic unity in the face of existential threat. The wedding ceremony itself was a significant court event, demonstrating the Ottoman dynasty's determination to maintain traditional practices even as their political power crumbled around them. For Mehmed VI, seeing his daughter married into another prominent line of the imperial family represented both personal satisfaction and dynastic strategy during an increasingly desperate period. The marriage of Sabiha and Ömer Faruk produced 3 daughters who would become important figures in the continuing story of the Ottoman dynasty in exile. Their first daughter, Fatma Neslisha, was born in 1921, followed by Zehra Hanzadeh in 1923 and Hibatullah Nekla in 1926. These 3 granddaughters of Mehmed VI represented the continuation of the Ottoman bloodline through the female line, carrying forward both the genetic heritage and the cultural memory of the empire. Their births occurred during the transition period between the empire's collapse and the family's forced exile, making them witnesses from infancy to the complete transformation of their family's circumstances. Fatma Neslisha, the eldest, would later marry into Egyptian royalty, creating connections between the scattered Ottoman imperial family and other displaced Middle Eastern monarchies. These marriage alliances helped maintain the social networks and cultural continuity that sustained aristocratic refugee communities throughout the mid-20th century. In 1924, when the Turkish Republic formally abolished the caliphate and exiled all members of the Ottoman dynasty, Sabiha found herself uprooted from her homeland along with her husband and young children. The family's exile took them through several European countries, including Switzerland and France, before they eventually settled in Egypt. The transition from palace life in Istanbul to refugee existence in Europe was particularly challenging for someone like Sabiha, who had known only imperial privilege during her first 30 years of life. The practical aspects of exile, securing housing, managing finances, and navigating foreign bureaucracies, required adaptations that her palace upbringing had not prepared her for. However, Sabiha's marriage into the line of Abdulmecid II provided some advantages during exile. The former caliph's family had international connections and resources that helped ease their transition to life outside Turkey. The pan-Islamic networks that had supported the caliphate also provided some measure of assistance to the exiled imperial family. During her years of exile, Sabiha lived primarily in Nice, France, and later in Egypt. Nice had become a favored destination for European and Middle Eastern aristocrats, offering a cosmopolitan environment where displaced royalty could maintain some semblance of their former social status. The city's location on the Mediterranean coast provided a climate and cultural atmosphere somewhat reminiscent of the homeland they had lost. The move to Egypt represented a particularly significant chapter in Sabiha's exile experience. Egypt had its own displaced royal family and harbored various other Middle Eastern aristocrats who had lost their positions due to political upheavals. This community provided cultural familiarity and social support that helped sustain the exiled Ottomans through the difficult middle decades of the 20th century. In Egypt, Sabiha's daughters were able to marry into other royal and aristocratic families, maintaining the elite social connections that had always been central to their family's identity. These marriages helped preserve not just their social status, but also their cultural heritage, as the various displaced royal families shared similar values and maintained traditional practice that connected them to their lost homelands. Sabiha's relationship with her father Mehmed VI was shaped by both the normal bonds between parent and child and the extraordinary circumstances of their shared experience of imperial collapse and exile. As Sultan from 1918 to 1922, Mehmed VI had presided over the final dissolution of the Ottoman Empire, making difficult decisions in impossible circumstances. The wedding of Sabiha in 1920 had been one of the last great ceremonial occasions of the Ottoman court, and her father had taken considerable pride in the dynastic alliance represented by her marriage to Umar Faruk. This wedding occurred during the period when Mehmed VI was attempting to maintain some form of constitutional monarchy while nationalist forces gained control of Anatolia. During the years of exile, Sabiha maintained contact with her father until his death in Sanremo in 1926. The shared experience of displacement created strong bonds between family members who had lost everything except each other. Her father's death in exile added another layer of loss to an already tragic situation, severing one of the last direct connections to their imperial past. In 1948, after 28 years of marriage, Sabiha divorced Umar Faruk. This divorce occurred during the post-war period when many aspects of traditional life were being questioned and reformed, even within exile communities. The end of her marriage marked another significant transition in a life already marked by dramatic changes and upheavals. The divorce may have reflected both personal incompatibilities that developed over the long years of exile and the changing social norms of the mid-20th century. Even within aristocratic circles, traditional arranged marriages were increasingly subject to scrutiny, and women were beginning to assert greater autonomy over their personal lives. Following her divorce, Sabiha continued to live in Egypt and France, maintaining relationships with her daughters and their growing families. She remained involved in the social networks of displaced Middle Eastern royalty, providing continuity and cultural memory for a generation that had been born into exile and had no direct experience of the imperial life their parents had lost. Sabiha lived to see the major geopolitical transformations of the mid-20th century, including the end of European colonialism in the Middle East, the establishment of Israel, and the rise of new forms of nationalism and political organization throughout the region. Her long life provided her with perspective on how dramatically the world had changed since her birth in an Ottoman palace in 1894. She died on August 26, 1971, in Egypt, at the age of 77. Her death occurred during a period when the Middle East was being reshaped by the aftermath of the 1967 Arab-Israeli War and the rise of new political movements throughout the region. She was buried at Ashiyan Cemetery, her final resting place, reflecting the cosmopolitan nature of her exile existence. Through her three daughters, Sabiha created important bridges between the Ottoman imperial family and other Middle Eastern royal lines, particularly in Egypt. These connections helped preserve cultural continuity and maintain social networks that sustained the identity of displaced aristocratic communities throughout the 20th century. Sabiha's life exemplifies the experience of aristocratic women who lived through the collapse of traditional empires and the emergence of modern nation-states. Her adaptability and resilience demonstrate how individuals could maintain dignity and cultural identity while accepting the irreversible nature of political transformation. Her story illustrates both the human cost of imperial collapse and the possibilities for creating meaningful new lives in radically changed circumstances. On November 5, 1912, Mehmed VI welcomed his only son with Müveddet Kadun at the Vahdettin Pavilion in Çengelköy, Istanbul. Named Mehmed Ertugrul, the infant prince represented both the continuation of the Ottoman male line and his father's hope for dynastic succession. His birth occurred during the First Balkan War as the empire suffered devastating territorial losses that would fundamentally alter its strategic position. Ertugrul's birth came 20 years after his eldest sister Ulviye, making him significantly younger than his siblings and creating a different generational experience within the imperial family. While his sisters had memories of the empire's final period of relative stability, Ertugrul would grow up entirely within the context of imperial collapse, foreign occupation, and eventual exile. The choice of names for the prince reflected both Ottoman tradition and contemporary political circumstances. Mehmed honored the dynasty's founder and greatest sultan, while Ertugrul recalled the legendary father of Osman the first Ottoman ruler. These names evoked the empire's glorious past at a moment when its future appeared increasingly uncertain. Ertugrul's early years unfolded against the backdrop of catastrophic military defeats and political upheaval. He was barely 6 years old when the First World War began, and still a child when the Ottoman Empire entered the conflict on the side of the Central Powers. His childhood was shaped by the realities of wartime Istanbul, where food shortages, foreign occupation, and political uncertainty became normal features of daily life. Unlike his sisters, who had experienced the traditional rhythms of imperial court life during their early years, Ertugrul grew up in a palace atmosphere dominated by crisis management and desperate political maneuvering. His father's accession to the Sultanate in 1918 occurred under circumstances that made clear the empire's desperate situation. Mehmed VI became Sultan precisely because he was seen as someone who might be able to negotiate the empire's survival with the victorious Allied powers. The young prince's education necessarily adapted to these changing circumstances. While he received instruction in the traditional subjects considered appropriate for an Ottoman prince, languages, literature, Islamic law, and military science, the practical relevance of this education became increasingly questionable as the empire's political structure disintegrated around him. In 1922, when Ertugrul was just 10 years old, his world collapsed entirely. The advance of nationalist forces toward Istanbul forced his father to flee the capital aboard a British warship, beginning an exile that would last the rest of their lives. For the young prince, this departure from Istanbul represented not just a temporary displacement, but the complete loss of the only world he had ever known. The initial phase of exile took the imperial family to Malta and then to Italy, where they eventually settled in San Remo. For a child who had grown up in the vast palaces of Istanbul with their elaborate gardens and countless servants, the reduced circumstances of exile represented a dramatic adjustment. The family's lifestyle, while still comfortable by ordinary standards, was modest compared to their former imperial grandeur. Ertugrul's education continued in exile, but now with the understanding that he would never rule the empire for which his previous training had prepared him. His tutors had to balance maintaining his cultural identity as an Ottoman prince with preparing him for life as a private citizen in European society. This dual challenge shaped his intellectual development throughout his adolescence. During his teenage years in exile, Ertugrul received a European education that reflected his family's new circumstances. He studied in Italy and France, acquiring fluency in these languages while maintaining his Turkish and Arabic. This multilingual education positioned him to navigate the cosmopolitan exile communities where displaced Middle Eastern royalty gathered during the interwar period. His education emphasized both classical European subjects and the cultural heritage of the Ottoman Empire. This combination created a complex identity. He remained deeply connected to his Ottoman heritage while developing the skills and perspectives necessary for life in 20th century Europe. The tension between these two aspects of his identity would characterize his entire adult life. Unlike his sisters, who could potentially marry into other royal or aristocratic families and thereby maintain some version of their traditional social status, Ertugrul faced the unique challenge of being the male heir to a dynasty that no longer existed. His education had to prepare him for a life without clear precedent or obvious purpose. As Ertugrul reached adulthood, he confronted the reality that he would never exercise any official political role or continue the Ottoman dynasty through marriage and children. He never married, leaving no heirs to carry forward the male line of the empire that had once controlled territories from the Balkans to Yemen. His adult life was marked by the peculiar isolation experienced by displaced royalty, too elevated by birth and training for ordinary middle-class existence, yet lacking any meaningful role or purpose in the modern world. He maintained the dignity and bearing of an Ottoman prince while accepting the reality that these titles had become purely ceremonial and personal. Contemporary accounts suggest that Ertugrul struggled with the psychological challenges of his situation. The weight of representing the end of 6 centuries of dynastic continuity, combined with the complete absence of any constructive outlet for his abilities and training, created an existential burden that few people in history have had to bear. The relationship between Ertugrul and his father, Mehmed VI, was shaped by both normal parental affection and the extraordinary burden of representing a dynasty's final generation. Mehmed VI had become sultan at the worst possible moment in Ottoman history, presiding over military defeat, foreign occupation, and eventual exile. His son represented both his greatest hope and his most profound disappointment. During their years together in exile, father and son shared the experience of displacement while carrying very different psychological burdens. Mehmed VI had at least ruled as sultan, however briefly and under impossible circumstances. Ertugrul faced the more complex challenge of maintaining imperial identity without ever having exercised imperial authority. The former sultan's death in 1926, when Ertugrul was just 14, added another layer of loss to an already tragic situation. The young prince not only mourned his father's death, but also confronted the reality that he was now the senior male representative of a dynasty that existed only in memory and in the diminished community of Ottoman exiles. On July 2, 1944, Ertugrul died suddenly in Cairo at the age of 31. According to some accounts, his death followed a collapse after a tennis match, suggesting either a heart condition or some other underlying health problem that may have been exacerbated by the psychological stresses of his situation. His death in Cairo, far from both his birthplace in Istanbul and his exile home in Europe, reflected the scattered nature of the Ottoman diaspora by the 1940s. Family members had dispersed across multiple continents, maintaining connections through correspondence and occasional visits, but no longer living as a cohesive unit. The circumstances of his death, sudden, premature, and leaving no heirs, seemed to symbolize the final extinction of the Ottoman imperial line. While his sisters had married and produced children who carried forward some version of the imperial heritage, Ertugrul's death without issue represented the definitive end of the possibility that the Ottoman dynasty might someday be restored. Ertugrul was buried in the Abbas Hilmi Pasha Mausoleum in Cairo, reflecting the connections between displaced Ottoman royalty and other exiled Middle Eastern aristocrats. Abbas Hilmi Pasha had been the last Khedive of Egypt before the British established their protectorate, making his mausoleum an appropriate resting place for another displaced heir to a defunct throne. The location of his burial emphasized the international character of the exile community that sustained displaced royalty during the mid-20th century. These communities provided practical support and cultural continuity for people whose traditional social structures had been destroyed by political revolution and modernization. His grave in Cairo serves as a symbol of the diaspora that scattered the Ottoman imperial family across multiple continents. Unlike his ancestors, who were buried in elaborate imperial tombs in Istanbul, Ertugrul's final resting place reflects both the reduced circumstances of exile and the cosmopolitan connections that sustained displaced aristocrats during this period. Ertugrul's death marked the end of the Ottoman imperial line in the male succession, though the dynasty continued through his sister's descendants. His life story illustrates the particular challenges faced by male heirs to abolish monarchies. Unlike female members of displaced dynasties, who could potentially marry into other aristocratic families, the male heirs carried the full weight of dynastic extinction. His brief life serves as a case study in the psychological costs of imperial collapse. Born into a dynasty that had ruled for 6 centuries, he died as a private citizen with no political role, no heirs, and no prospect of restoration. His experience demonstrates how individual lives were shaped by the great political transformations of the 20th century. The tragedy of Ertugrul's story extends beyond his personal fate to represent the broader human cost of the transition from empire to nation-state that characterized the modern Middle East. His death symbolized the definitive end of an era, marking the moment when the Ottoman Empire passed from living memory into history. The 4 children of Mehmed VI, Munire, who died in infancy, Ulviye, who lived to see the modern Turkish Republic, Sabiha, who found refuge in Egypt, and Ertugrul, who died young and childless, together tell the story of how imperial collapse reshapes individual destinies across generations. Their lives traced an arc from the palaces of Istanbul to exile communities scattered across Europe and the Middle East. They witnessed the transformation of the Ottoman Empire from a multi-continental power to a memory preserved by displaced families living far from their ancestral homeland. Through their marriages, travels, and adaptations to changing circumstances, they demonstrated both the resilience of the human spirit and the profound costs of political upheaval. The legacy of Mehmed VI extends beyond his brief and troubled reign to encompass the human story of his children's adaptation to a world that had no place for Ottoman princes and princesses. Their experiences illustrate how individuals navigate the collapse of everything they had been taught to consider permanent and natural. In their dignity, their struggles, and their ultimate acceptance of irreversible change, they embodied both the end of an empire and the beginning of new forms of identity and community. Today, descendants of these imperial children live as private citizens across the globe, carrying forward cultural memories and family traditions that connect them to one of history's most significant empires. Their story reminds us that behind every great political transformation lie countless individual human experiences of loss, adaptation, and resilience. The Ottoman Empire may have ended, but the human legacy of its final imperial family continues in ways both seen and unseen, connecting past and present across the generations.